Hello everyone, Gaara here once again and welcome to a brand new video. I've been following Reddit for the past couple of weeks as always, and yeah, it wasn't difficult to notice that there's a ton of drama going on surrounding the game. And after watching Noxious's video about the problems in Hearthstone, and then finally Crip's video, which I watched yesterday I believe, and yeah, I was watching the videos. They have some good points, but I also wanted to give you my opinion because people seem to like that when I do that, and I haven't expressed my opinion about it yet, and I haven't made a video about it. So here is what I think, pretty much summarized, not too depth. You can always ask me because I try to make it short in videos and not ramble all the time too much. So I want to start this with giving props to Blizzard. I think that Blizzard is trying to improve. I'm playing the game since open beta, and yeah, I obviously witnessed all the stages of the game, and there were phases where I liked the game much more, and there were phases where I didn't like the game too much. And I think it became the worst with the release of Whispers of the Old Gods, but I'm getting into this in a bit. Yeah, what people are expressing the most is, yeah, we're facing so many shamans. Shamans is the biggest problem in the game. Shaman is so broken, blah blah, the game is so boring and all that stuff. It is true, but most people do is just whine about it and not give any constructive criticism or how you can improve it. There are some people that have some suggestions, but I don't know, I don't know if they are realistic suggestions, because they don't really know how it works in the team. Like if people are forced to release a certain amount of content per year, you know, that I can't do anything about it, like how difficult it is to design and how difficult it is to implement into the game and all that stuff. Like, I don't know. What I know for sure is that you can give like general suggestions about like card design, because there's no excuse for it, right? Because you can choose what cards you will ultimately end up having in the game. I cannot say, yeah, you have to release an expansion every week, because that is probably utopic and this will never happen, so there's no point in me saying that. And I want to point out that I think Crip mentioned that the main problem in Hearthstone are the 1 and 2 drops and the power level of those. And yeah, on the surface maybe, but then again not really. It is not really difficult to counter Pirate Warrior, for example. They are great decks. The problem is, the real problem are the decks that counter the counters of the aggro decks. And this goes to the first main issue that I want to address, is that since Whispers of the Old Gods, I mean, it started with League of Explorers, but it wasn't an issue there, that Blizzard is predetermining what decks we are going to play. And this is a really bad concept, and it really limits deck building and also their so-called problem solving, because they basically force us in playing a very small amount of decks. And as you can remember with, for example, the Beast Druid team, they were pushing for almost 2 years with no success. In every expansion they introduced like 1 or 2 Beast Druid cards. The same goes for dragon decks. With the Blackrock expansion they introduced the first dragons, and then they pushed more and more dragons, and dragon decks were never playable. There you can see that when Blizzard tries to implement something, it is not very successful. It takes multiple years to get it to work. And yeah, I think, was it with Whispers of the Old Gods that some Beast Druid emerged that was somewhat playable with Menagerie Warden, but it took so long till that happened. So, and if Blizzard forces us just with the power level of certain cards like Kazakus or the Jade mechanic, we are forced to play those. And if you look at the past, how long it took them to successfully implement a new archetype it is definitely not a good idea to force us from the get-go to play a certain archetype. I hope you can follow me here. So, the 1 drops, 2 drops. Oh, first I wanted to say, so League of Explorers was like the last super good expansion, I would say. All the especially the legendaries that were introduced, they're all playable, have all super unique and cool effects, and they made so many different deck types viable. And those cards, the most important thing I want to say about those cards is you can play them in theory in every class. You can play, let's say, Reno Jackson, you can build a Reno Rogue. We've seen many streamers experimentating. It's super fun to watch to make like Reno Rogue viable. I also made a beta letter series about Reno Warrior. I personally enjoyed playing Reno Warrior, and you didn't get punished too much, but playing it. Yes, you got punished by, let's say, Druid because you don't play double execute and shield slide, but that's like my own issue. But I can still like play around and add a BGH or whatever. But I didn't get punished by the majority of the ladder decks. Like right now, for example. Right now, no control deck besides the Kazakus decks can be viable because of the Jade mechanic and Kazakus. You will never, because control decks are the way how Hearthstone works. They will eventually go to fatigue because they don't get aggressive on the board. They fight for board control slowly, they draw a bunch of cards, like very slow turns, a lot of removal. So because Hearthstone has only 30 cards in the deck, eventually you will go to fatigue or close to fatigue. Since they completely removed the fatigue aspect from the game with introducing the Jade mechanic, there's like an insane amount of decks that you can't play anymore. Like all the quote-unquote fun decks. Like with every expansion, the fun decks got kicked out of the game more and more and more. And I guess fun decks are kind of bad, but you could still, like, if you invest an insane amount of time, you can still make them viable. But right now, with the latest expansion, I still want to go back to Whispers of the Old Gods, because it kind of started there with the Katoon mechanic. If Katoon decks would be tier 1, then you are forced to play Katoon decks, because the Katoon specific cards are just too powerful, right? The Ancient Shearbearer that gives you 10 armor with a 6/6 minion for 7 mana, Emperor Veclor, Katoon itself. Those cards are just way too powerful. So if you can make a Katoon deck tier 1, you basically, no other control deck can ever possibly compete with that. It's just, the power level is just too high. And Katoon decks were viable, so I think compared to the Jade mechanic, Katoon was great because it was tier 2 clearly, but you can still beat those decks in different ways, right? They don't draw the Katoon buffers, you can still play them to fatigue. We've seen like a lot of Resident Sleeper Control Warrior mirrors, but I still enjoyed those. And yeah, you could still play control decks, and those control decks could still be the aggro decks. You still had always a chance to beat all the other decks, even if you're targeting one specific group of decks. And that is, I think, very important. And I know that I'm just rambling and I'm mixing a lot of things. There's not a lot of structure in what I'm saying. Okay, the main thing people were wondering about on Reddit and everywhere pretty much is that you're facing 40-50% shamans. I think this is like an exaggeration. Yes, sometimes it's more shamans, sometimes it's less, but over the course of the month it is around 35% of shamans. It is by far more than any other class you're facing. But the problem is with the 35% shamans, if you're targeting those 35% shamans, you're still facing 65% of other classes, right? And most of the time it is right now Reno Mage, Reno Lock, some Priest, some Rogue, some Druid. Not so many Druids. Warriors, Pirate Warriors, and those Shamans, of course. And there are ways, for example, this is what I wanted to lead up to the point where I was saying you can counter Pirate Shaman and Pirate Warrior with, let's say, Control Warrior. Not what Blizzard stated in their blue post. This is what scares me a lot, by the way. It is, on the plus side, it is creating new memes, But on the negative side, this is really scary when you look at Blizzard saying, yeah, if you want to counter Shaman or Pirate Warrior, just play Dragon Priest or Reno Lock. This is just, what the hell? This is, for example, Reno Lock is not a good counter to Pirate Warrior. No, you die consistent 25. Pirate Warrior, on the other hand, is a very consistent counter to Reno Lock. You use right now Pirate Warrior to counter Reno Lock, not the other way around. So this is really, really the opposite. But yeah, you can counter Pirate Warrior. The number one counter to Pirate Warrior is Control Warrior. Control Warrior has by far the highest win rate versus Pirate Warrior. And this is why I also think the issue right now is not the aggro decks. I mean, it spawns issues in a different way though. The problem is the counters to my Control Warrior. Why do you still see so few Control Warriors, even though it is such a successful counter to Aggro Shaman and to Pirate Warrior? Because it has literally around 5% or so win rate versus Jade decks, which are emerging more and more. And this is like a topic for another video, why Jade decks are getting more and more popular, because they can pretty much beat anything. Yeah, you lose to the Kazakus decks because you can't fatigue them. For example, Reno Mage, the way how you would need to beat a Reno Mage S Control Warrior right now is you get a lucky Dirty Rat and pull the Kazakus or Bran or the Manic Soulcaster. The other cards are pretty much irrelevant. Or you fatigue them, and if they play the combo with Bran, Kazakus, Manic Soulcaster, then it's impossible to fatigue them because they will get 2 cards back in the deck. If they usually, the way how you play the matchup is usually you wait till you have like 5 cards left in the deck, then you play the full combo, then you get 2 Kazakus back in the deck, and you get 2 10 mana potions in your hand. That's 4 10 mana potions in a fatigue matchup. There's absolutely no way a Control Warrior can beat that. And this goes with all the Kazakus decks, like Reno Lock has, for example, Jaraxxus instead of the 2 additional potions. It's just, you can't beat that. So the way how Blizzard designed or is designing new cards is that you're really forced. Like right now, I think they didn't do that bad of a job. I think they spawned like a triangle. Obviously they knew when they introduce a card like Kazakus, it is such a powerful anti-aggro deck. I don't think in their mind they were thinking it will push every single control deck out of the game, but this is what it does, because the level of play we have right now is that one card is just enough, that it rises the power level of a deck so much that it pushes pretty much every other control deck out of the game if you introduce like a new powerful control card, which Kazakus is. It is not just an anti-aggro card, but it is also one of the best, if not the best, control card as well in the game, because of the different potions you can choose, right? If you choose the 1 mana potion, you have the most effective 1 mana spell, anti-aggro spell in the game, but you can choose a 10 mana spell and have the greediest spell possible. You can spawn 3 minions and buff them by 6 HP, for example. Yes, there's always like a lot of random effects included, which is amazing, not really. For example, you have only a 50% chance to get the board clear. This is like another reason why Reno decks are not the best decks to counter aggressive decks. I mean, when you really think about it, it is below 50% that you get an AoE, and that is like the number 1 spell you're looking for. First, you need to draw the Kazakus, and second, you have to get the AoE spell, but 50% is not really consistent. So if you're really relying on that, that's terrible, right? Yeah, that is one of the reasons why Reno decks are not the best decks to counter aggro decks. And you have to draw your Reno on 6 pretty much every single time. So what I think Blizzard did was, besides, as I said, it was, I want to go back to the Whispers of the God expansion, that was already bad, but it wasn't that hurtful. The number 1 hurtful thing for the game was Yogg-Saron and Tusker Totemic, but I will talk about this in the end. But yeah, this predetermined of predetermination of what we are going to play in the game before we we can't really experimentate and come up with new archetypes or anything. Blizzard says, okay, we're gonna introduce those Katoon cards, you're gonna play those Katoon cards. We're gonna introduce those Jade cards, and we're gonna introduce Kazakus, and you will play, and the Pirates, you will play Pirate decks, you will play Jade decks, and you will play Reno decks, because they will be the strongest decks in the game, and screw all the other decks. So I think what they want to do is keep the game fresh, so we see new decks being played. I think one bad thing about this, I think the variety of decks we have is way too little, right? If you just leave the game as it is, we can play so many different decks, right? Just as I mentioned with Reno, why Reno is such a great card, you don't get punished by not playing Reno Jackson. It is, for example, in Control versus Control decks, it is not such a powerful card, right? You get 4/6 stats for 6 mana, that is terrible in a Control matchup, but the heal effect is super, and a super anti-aggro tool, and this is when you make it work, it's a great feeling, and you can experimentate with this all day long. As I said, you can play it in all classes. We've seen people trying Reno Druid for fun, Reno Priest. I personally was playing Reno Warrior, but right now we can only play Reno Priest, Reno Mage, and Reno Warlock. Nothing else. All the other Reno decks got killed. When you think about it, this is just 30% than before, a variety of decks just in that archetype, right? And what it also did is, besides that we can only play 30% of the, like, you cannot play any other Reno deck, that is guaranteed. Kazakus is just way too powerful. And it's not just that the 3 classes got Kazakus, they also got, Priest got Razar, Mage got Solia, what her name is, and Warlock got Krull, or whatever his name is, yeah. In addition, those cards see very rare play, but still, this is what they have access to, and the other classes don't have access to, so Blizzard clearly doesn't want people to play fun Reno decks, because this is what viewers enjoy and streamers also enjoy to play around. So I guess Blizzard doesn't like people having fun. This is why I want to also address the combo decks. Like, combo decks are probably the most fun decks, besides the wacky Reno decks that you could build in the past. The combo decks, yeah, Freeze Mage, Patron Warrior, Combo Druid was probably not so fun for your opponent, Miracle Rogue, and just combo decks in general. And obviously Blizzard is not putting any effort in pushing control decks, combo decks. I think this is a sign of laziness, because combo decks are very difficult to balance, right? Because people, the win rate will differentiate from player to player by so much, right? The better you play the deck, the higher your win rate will be. We've seen people getting rank 1 legend with Freeze Mage, and other people just horribly failing with it. But it is so much fun to watch. For the streamer, for streamers it is fun to play those decks, and for viewers it's fun to watch those decks. Like Miracle Rogue was one of the most popular decks to watch on Twitch, and yeah, it is really sad. So they are really limiting the decks, the amount of decks we can play by much, and they're simplifying the game a lot. Like, all the mechanics they're pushing, like the dragon mechanic, which is finally somewhat playable in just one deck, pretty much, only in Priest. It is very simplified. It's super easy to play. You mulligan for curve, you play in curve, you do some arena trading, and oftentimes you don't even play board clear cards, because all board clear cards in Hearthstone are pretty bad. Even Dragonfire Potion, because Azudrake is played in like 90% of the decks. Is not a complete board clear, and yeah, it's just super easy to play those decks and super boring to watch those decks, because there's oftentimes what viewer also like is like all this thinking behind certain turns. And if you play a Jade deck, you basically, okay, I play my turn 1 Jade, I play my turn 3 Jade, I play my turn 4 Jade, I play my turn 6 Jade, and my opponent eventually can't deal with them anymore, and then I win. It's a super boring playstyle, but super effective, obviously, because proactive plays are always stronger than all other reactive plays in Hearthstone. It will always be the case, probably. But yeah, I will really want to pinpoint some the biggest problems, right? So deck variety getting limited from expansion to expansion. It started getting the worst with the introduction of Whispers of the Old Gods, and it got super bad with Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. And they introduced the Jade mechanic, this triangle, and I don't want to talk about, I will talk briefly about the buff hand mechanic, but this triangle that exists right now is the Reno decks, the Jade decks, and the aggro decks, right? And in their mind, probably, I'm not sure if this is really what they thought, is that the pirate decks will counter the Jade decks, and the Jade decks will counter the Reno decks, and the Reno decks will counter the aggro decks. The buff hand mechanic, I don't know if they just tested it at all, but the buff hand mechanic is one of those Triforce mechanics that was given to warriors, hunters, and paladins, but compared to Kazakus or pirates or Jades, it is just completely unplayable. And I want to give a reason why it's unplayable. I think the main problem with it is obviously it is slow. You sacrifice tempo for future power plays, right? I think the number one issue with the buff hand mechanic is that it buffs a random card in your hand. Like if I play a buff hand mechanic minion on turn 3 or turn 2, right? I really have to, because how aggressive Hearthstone is, you really have to understand, and I hope Blizzard understands how Hearthstone works. I mean, they created the game. If you sacrifice tempo, you really have to come strong the following turn, because a lot of games are decided by turn 4, turn 5. Some games decided by turn 3. Like if I can't deal with it 1-drop and 2-drop, and I can't deal with a 3-drop, I will lose the game because I take so much damage in the process. One example, just a short example, is Reno Lock versus Pirate Shaman. If I have Buccaneer on 1, can't kill it, I play Flametongue Totem on 2, you have life tap. If I go just like a South Sea Deckhand or like a weapon on 3 and push face damage, I will win the game on turn 4 or on turn 5 with just 1 burn damage. You will never get to your to your Reno turn, just as an example. So if I buff a minion on turn 2 with my buff minion hand mechanic, I sacrifice tempo, I don't do anything, just play a very weak minion that gets effectively traded off. Then I need to have a 3 mana minion that comes on the board and is strong, so I can start my comeback. But the problem right now with the buff mechanic is it chooses a random minion. So what happened is, like, I was playing all the buff mechanic classes, and for example in Hunter, because you play automatically a lot of minions in those decks. And if you have a full, like let's say 5 minions in my hand, and I play a 2 mana buff minion hand mechanic, and then I buff my Highman, that is just basically throwing the game right now, because you get really punished, as I explained, by not doing anything. There's absolutely no point in buffing my Highman, because I will die on turn 5, or die the turn I play the Highman. So I basically play a very bad minion now in 2017, a very understated minion, basic minion, and all my future plays are also weak till I lose the game. And I think this is the number one problem. I don't think it would be overpowered if you can choose which minion you buff. I think you have to, if you want to have this mechanic just be remotely viable. As I said, right now, if you want the buff mechanic to be succeeding, I don't know how difficult it would be to change, because it goes for all the buff mechanic. Paladin is the closest to viable, and the main reason why buff Paladin is the closest to viable from all the buff mechanics is because it buffs all the minions at the same time. Why Paladin doesn't work has different reasons. Just it goes back to you can't play control decks right now because the Jade decks are countering you and the Kazakus decks. This speaks for all control decks, including the buff mechanic. I'm just pointing out that the main reason why the buff mechanic absolutely doesn't work in Hunter and in Warrior is because you can't choose. Like, you have your Armor Smith, which is great being buffed, but if you buff then your Gromage, there's no point in that during the game, okay? The random aspect, again, random aspect ruining an entire mechanic. In Paladin it works because you buff all the minions at the same time, but Paladin loses because Paladin is extremely weak to the phase decks, and it gets pushed out by Kazakus and Jade decks. And now I can really transition into the triangle again. The phase decks are hard countering the Jade decks, right? And I think Blizzard wanted it to be this way, right? The Jade decks will just counter control decks and also the Kazakus decks, but they have to be weak to something. And this is what I think they introduced the new Pirate 1-drop and patches. So we have aggressive decks that are viable because they nerfed so many of the aggressive cards. They nerfed Lepanum, Arcane Golem, you name it. Almost every single aggressive card in the game was nerfed already. So they implemented something, and people really like the Pirate team, and so they printed like a Pirate 1-drop and made this viable, and just one card was enough to make it like close to broken. And they succeeded in that part. Pirate decks are countering Jade decks, and it's working really well. What ended up not working so well is that the Reno decks that are supposed to counter the Pirate decks are not really countering the Pirate decks, and this is where this triangle breaks. The Jade decks are also countering the Reno decks. This works as well, but the Reno decks, what I really like in this correlation is that the Jade decks, the Reno decks have a chance to beat the Jade decks. Like, but their Jade decks are clearly favored in that matchup. But the problem really is on the bottom is that there's only a type from these three that is really countering something. Okay, actually, the two decks class, or the two, how do I even call it? The two archetypes that are really countering something is the Pirates are countering the Jades, and the Jades are countering the Reno decks. But the Reno decks are not really countering the aggro decks. You can argue that Reno Mage is successfully countering it, but it is not as favored as it should be as a counter deck. And yeah, this is why you see so many aggressive decks. Another reason is it's so effective to play fast decks on ladder because of a high win rate, but it doesn't matter as much on high legend or as soon as you are in legend, because all that matters there is really the win rate if you want to get into super high legend. Yeah, because later you need above 60% win rate, and then you can't just spam aggro decks with 55% win rate because you will not get anywhere, even though the games are super fast. And the Pirate decks can beat everything. That is the problem. They're just the fastest decks, but they can literally, they're on paper the most favorite in all matchups, across the matchups, and they're have the shortest game time. There's like multiple reasons why we should play aggro decks over the other decks. And yes, what I said, because Blizzard predetermined the decks we are supposed to play with introducing the Jade mechanic and Kazakus, and I explained earlier why it pushes out the control decks out of the game, because you can't go to fatigue and all that stuff. But if I can't counter aggro decks with Kazakus, Reno decks, as Blizzard wants me to do, what am I supposed to do now? Like, because they limit my deck building creativity so much, especially with the last 3 expansions. What am I supposed to do? This is where the game becomes boring. Right now it transitions into the end phase of Mean Streets of Gadgetzan, where you try to make the most optimal Jade decks, because Jade decks still beat the Reno decks, but you can also make them like anti-aggro with implementing some heal spells and more board clear, so you have the Jade decks that can beat everything. It is kind of like the new mid-range archetype that can beat all control decks or like goes into super late game as well. It's super weird, but yeah, it is super boring. We have one mid-range deck, which is Dragon Priest. Again, we only have one dragon deck, and it is Priest, and it is not strong enough because it doesn't have enough anti-aggro tools. You sometimes still play Dragon Priest, but it is, the thing is that the curves are just faster from Shaman and Warrior, and you have access to weapons, so it's much easier for those two classes to fight for bot control early. And Priest has like no chance. Priest has those very bad removal cards like Shadow of Pain, where you just kill one minion, and Warrior, for example, can play 3 minions for 1 mana, and then have a weapon and clear your board. And this is where Priest really struggles. This is why Priest is still kind of like a tier 2 deck. But it is boring, and there's only one viable dragon deck. Again, almost no playable decks, much less playable decks than before. You cannot play any fun decks, or much less variety in playing fun decks, because you just get punished by so many different decks. Yeah, you get super punished by the aggro decks most of the time, but you cannot play fun control decks just because the Jade decks and the Kazakus decks just push you completely out of the game. And I think this is the main problem, because we are forced, as I said, you can counter those aggro decks with like Control Warrior, Control Shaman, but the reason why we see almost no Control Warrior and no Control Shaman is because we can't outvalue a Jade Druid or a Jade Shaman. We can't outvalue Kazakus, and so we are basically forced to make those Reno decks viable. It's just super boring, and I think this is where lies the two main issues lie in the game. First, Blizzard is predetermining what we are going to play, what decks we're gonna come up with. We are forced to play, like with this expansion especially, we are forced to play J decks because of the overall power level of the mechanic, and we are forced to play Reno decks, but only 3 very specific Reno decks, deck variety. And yeah, the second problem is that you're pushing out deck variety more and more with predetermining, with the power level of those new mechanics. And this is my opinion. Yes, I know I was rambling. I'm not even sure if I should upload this video. Yeah, I will probably upload it anyways, just because I was talking here so much about this. I hope you guys like it anyways. I know for the next video I will do a little bit more structure. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, give me a like and let me know what you guys think. And if you have any questions, always ask them in the comments. I will answer them all. Before I forget, there was one more thing. I said I will talk about it at the end of the video. Yogg-Saron and Tusker Totemic were the 2 main issues from a competitive standpoint in Whispers of the Old Gods. It pretty much ruined competitive Hearthstone for 7 months, I think. This is the last time I tracked it. That's the period where Yogg-Saron and Tusker were around. They determined pretty much all preliminaries and up to last chance qualifier, and then they nerfed it before BlizzCon, and that is just pretty outrageous. That is why I can't be salty anymore about the game, by the way. Every pro player that goes through the phase of Yogg-Saron and Tusker Totemic and survived it, you pretty much have a Stoneheart skin. Yeah, but since Hearthstone is a esport now, it is kind of a joke that a card like Yogg-Saron can be around for that long. And just to give you guys that don't know Yogg-Saron a quick rundown, it is a card for 10 mana that pretty much can bring you back into the game at any board state, at any life total, at any hand size. So if you have no cards in hand, 1 HP, no board, your opponent has a full board, full hand, and 30 life, you can win with playing that card. And now you might think, okay, it's a 10 mana card, man. You mainly play this card in Malygos Druid, which was one of the 2 most dominant decks. And you don't play it for pretty much 10 mana, right? Because Druid goes like 1 mana, 4 mana, and then innovate something out for 6 mana, then 5 mana, maybe ramp up there again to 7 mana. In between you play 0 mana 8/8s, and you will pretty much get to the point where you can play Yogg-Saron. So if you can guarantee to go to the point where you can play Yogg-Saron, it's very stupid that for 7 months so many big tournaments are decided, qualifiers, countless qualifiers are decided by turn 3 RNG and turn 10 RNG, like absolutely busted RNG. Yeah, and that's the last thing. So if you want to treat the game more serious, you have to release more frequent patches. And yeah, that was my final point, and thanks so much for watching, and see you guys. Peace.